information. We are consciousness, and we
It
create
is,
this
in
reality.
fact, sorry to interrupt, it is, in fact, Oliver, what your website's called, isn't it? Matrix Vision, Matrix Knowledge, that is, isn't it?
Yes, right.
So that's the thing, and it's a very good point, Thomas, if I may say, that you are talking about the manipulation of information at a primal
Mhm.
level, and as soon as you grasp that, as you say, it's not so phenomenal to do those things, and I'm sure that the three of us have noted the great metaphor of the Matrix movies for some of this stuff. And once you realize the principle of how it works, inserting things into the Matrix and how people are dressed and what they can do and how they can move around and how they can jump across building tops isn't really that phenomenal anymore. It ceases to be quite the feat because you're not treating the physical as the primal anymore. So you don't have to create that, as you say, that hugely sophisticated organism of a fruit fly, and then multiply it, and then change the sort of thermodynamics of the environment to create this energy. You're not doing it on a scientific biological level. You're doing it at the primal level. So as you mentioned earlier, you're going in really and just changing a line of code just to adapt it
Mhm.
momentarily.
Mhm.
And I think once we start to perceive it in that way, um, a funny thing happens. It kind of demystifies the magic a little bit, but it also ups your game as well. It raises the quality bar because, as you say, rather than
Mhm.
people running around with magical abilities like in some Hollywood movie, you realize that that isn't the thing to do, and that's
Mhm.
not the point of it. And so there is an inverse correlation between the more power you have, the less you feel a necessity to demonstrate it. And that I see that over and over again. And the most powerful individuals I've met in this world, in this life, in this space, very rarely demonstrate it. And when they do, as Thomas has just explained to us very articulately, it's within a certain environment. And so sometimes, if someone is going to do a levitation or they're going to move something, you can see them look around and you can see them assess what's going on in the environment. And if it's not appropriate, they won't do it because they're taking into account the consciousness that's there, and they're trying to diagnose, they're trying to do a scan, a sweep of the consciousness that's there
Mhm.
and say, is this event appropriate? Let me try and have some part in that. And if it isn't, they just won't do it. And then if their consciousness isn't switched into that, as you say with this sort of Uri Geller stuff, your psi uncertainty principle comes into play, which is that the law looks after itself and just says,
Mhm.
right, if this is going out to a TV audience, it's just going to be left with a question mark, which, if you look at any program on mainstream television, they always end with the same thing, which is this: the announcer says, so we still don't know the answer, but we've learnt some new things. And it always ends in that way. There's never
Mhm.
any conclusions, there's never any stamps of resolution at all. And for the wise man and woman, that's okay. And you start to realize why that is. And you start to propel yourself away from the mainstream core because you know that all the interesting stuff happens on the sort of pioneering fringe. And so necessarily you always move yourself to that edge because that's where the exciting, real, fascinating stuff is emerging. And so if you live in the mainstream core, you're not going to be exposed to that. And relatively speaking, what's happening on the fringe isn't relevant to you, and that's
Mhm.
okay as well.
Sure. We'll see. Just take these crop circles, for example. If they get to be taken very seriously in the larger society, one of two things will happen. One, they will stop. You won't have any more crop circles, or they will get very few and far between. Or certain things will happen, like suddenly a bunch of people will be motivated to go out and you know make crop circles. They will be discovered, and that will discredit it.
Mm.
So the low profile will be maintained one way or another. So as long as they are in the margin, then they can stay just the way they are. Matter of fact, they could even turn the gain up a little bit. Now, if they get to where they start to get out of the margin, the gain will be turned down, and that's the way these things work. They're there as a demonstration, and they're not there to force people to see something they're not ready to see.
And don't you find it interesting, Thomas, that as we've said all this, that some people are ready, some people aren't, and as you get closer to that phenomenon, you start to see the principle and see the wisdom in that. It is always amusing to me, and I say that, not egotistically. I mean, just purely, it is amusing to see campaigners who are absolutely focused on disclosing something or exposing something or getting whole groups of people to try and prove something to them. And I kind of look at these guys, and it is generally men. Women don't seem to have quite the same compulsion to do this very wisely, but I look at some of these guys and think, why are you doing that? I think what's more important than what you're actually trying to prove is why you're trying to prove it. And I think if they follow that trail of evidence, shall we say, it leads to like quite a personal spiritual question, which is highly relevant and highly important. And so, ironically, it sometimes means that you leave them to it. You leave them to their own discovery.
Oh yes, I think sometimes these folks are driven to do what they do. They get obsessed by it, just because the system feels that they need to turn the gain down a little bit, and so these guys get turned up a little bit so that they holler fraud, and nobody can prove it, and so on. And after they rant and rave a little bit, that turns the gain down to where it's more optimal, and then life goes on. So sometimes they're not just spoilers and troublemakers and people that are making it difficult for the rest of us. Sometimes I see them as a necessary part of the whole as well.
They are.
They're part of the balance. They're not you can get kind of upset with them, I guess. Sometimes they say things that are ridiculous, but they're part of the balance. That's necessary as well, as this whole learning lab that we're in needs to be optimized. You can't, you can't just push ahead and force everybody to see something and expect that that's going to have a wonderful result. It's not.
It's not, and I think it is curious that when you do see someone who is pursuing something of a phenomenal nature in the true sense of the word, or certainly an esoteric thing. I went to a conference in 2009 in Liverpool in England, and there was a sort of UFO flavour to part of it. There were a number of speakers, and one guy in particular there was absolutely committed to disclosing the reality and the truth of extraterrestrial contact. And he was, really dedicating every waking minute to this thing, and you could see it in his eyes, and he had these big bags under his eyes, and he seemed frantic and anxious all the time and stuff. And I just kind of like looked at him and just thought, well, I don't really think you need to do that, because it doesn't really serve any purpose for you. It should be just a very personal encounter, and you should be quite happy with that. And of course, you wouldn't necessarily say that to somebody, but then I stood back and thought, no, actually, that's wrong. You're doing exactly what you need to do right now, and you're serving a certain role, which we mustn't be necessarily disrespectful of and assume that we know better. Not at all. To some extent, a lot of people do need proof, and they need these figureheads who will say, well, let's look at the evidence, let's examine data, place it side by side, compare it, contrast it, and so on. Personally, I've never, ever felt the need to prove anything for myself or for anyone else. I just feel the truth of a thing through direct experience. And, it's extremely unscientific how I go about my stuff. However, I've found it advantageous to bring more scientific nature of analysis into what I do, because as I've gone along, I've found that some of the people who listen to what I say, that's helpful. That helps them conceptualize it and consider it in a more balanced way. So sometimes it becomes useful to build up a bit of a sort of multiple skill set to say, depending on what you're doing and depending on who you're talking to, it can be useful to have a spiritual tone or a scientific tone, or to have some sort of psychological reference points, or to speak with humor and to realize that having an entertainment value doesn't necessarily cheapen what you're doing. It entertains people to the point where you bring them to the edge of this vista, this panorama that you want to show them and say, well, I've brought you here, I've snuck you in through humor, and now you stand there and you look at that and think about what that means. And so, particularly with the comedian Bill Hicks, he was an out-and-out stand-up comedian. And yet, if you look at the content of his work, in the 90s, he was talking about metaphysics, he was talking about ethnobotany, he was talking about conspiracy, he was talking about freedom, civil liberties, choice, artistry, really important, fascinating topics, but they were all clothed, they were all robed in humor. And I bet that a lot of people who went along just to have a few beers and a few laughs at a Bill Hicks show went away on the first steps of a vast and mystical spiritual journey. So there isn't necessarily one way of dressing wisdom and spiritual truth. It is everywhere all the time, really. And even the guys who do it in a way that I personally would think, well, I would never do it that way. I respect that they have a role to play and they address a certain part of the system. And they're also, first and foremost, also on their own spiritual journey. And if they need to realize that being a campaigner isn't actually necessary, then that's the part of the journey that they're on, and you don't want to mess that up for them. You leave them to their own realization.
Yes, absolutely. Just like the Dutchman who had to demonstrate this 500 or more times, that he was,
Yeah.
I'd say he was driven to do that just because, he was given that ability and then kind of pushed to show it off. And just as well, he was made to disappear when it when it got to be a little too much.
I know.
So it just, the whole thing, you have to look at reality and what's going on here from a big picture. You have to see it from the whole. Like I was talking to somebody in an interview the other day, and they were saying, I have some friends, and they're so discouraged. They've been in this consciousness expansion and growth and spirituality, and they've been doing this and preaching it and going about it for a decade now, and they just don't see that it's making any difference. The world still, you pick up the newspaper and it still looks the same as it did before. They're just very discouraged that it's not working, and they're about ready to quit and so on. And it's like, well, it's not about them changing the world. It's about them just doing their own part, and let the world integrate that and take it as it will. You just do your part, and you don't need to have that result of a big prize at the end. You shouldn't be working for the prize. You should be working just to improve yourself, just to grow up. And as you grow up, you will help bring the whole into a better alignment and into a better place. But if you're working just to bring the whole into a better place without actually growing up, then you're either going to be ineffective, or what you do is going to be part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. So we don't need to see that we are changing the world so much as we need to change ourselves, which will in turn change the world, and let all that take place as it does in its own time.
And I think that's a fundamental realization which you can read about in the oneness of everything, and we're all one, and it's all one system flowing, interpenetrating each other. And I read that when I was 15 and saw that and thought, yeah, that's really good. Anyway, it took another 20 years really before I actually understood what the hell that meant. And it took another bunch of years on top of that to then bring that into experience, into life, or as I like to say, into the grocery store, or when I was brushing my teeth. I need to bring that stuff into felt experience. And I think that's one of the issues, that people do live in a state of separateness. And when